Alright, so Once Human received quite a few updates and it launched a few months ago already. I did a video when it launched, and today we're going to have a relook at it just to see whether the updates actually help the game or not. And I have to say, spoiler alert, the game cleaned up very, very nicely. Now, I just want to show you one thing, just want to draw your attention to one thing. This is the same system as I tested a few months ago, except for the GPU. Back then I used the 4070 Super. This is a 4070 Ti Super. So we're not going to be having a direct comparison to the frame rates, but just look at the CPU power. So currently we are sitting at around 90 watt, 100 watt CPU power, and I'm going to show you the CPU power for the previous video, the exact same settings, 1080p on the very high preset native resolution, and you can see it creeps up to 150 watt at times. But look at the temperatures, the usages, and the CPU power. It actually improved quite a lot with the new patch. Right, so we're back live, and this is 1080p on the very high preset with DLAA, so native resolution. And that's another thing that got added. Let me just show you the settings here quickly. Back then we did not have any upscalers except for this engine's built-in upscaler. So today we've got DLSS, we've got XeSS, we've got FSR. So this is actually pretty good, and you can see you've got all the presets here. One thing that I do want to also bring your attention to, so let's just use DLSS here. I'm going to open up the on-screen overlay for the frame rate. Now we're at 1080p, so we're not really CPU bound. You can see the GPU is sitting at 99% GPU usage. But if we enable DLSS upscaling here just on quality, and now it doesn't do it, the frame time graph became very, very unstable earlier. Probably because we are shifting a lot of load or reducing a lot of load on the GPU, and the frame time graph had a bit of an issue with that. You can see that it's not perfectly smooth as previously. So we just be testing at native DLAA at 1080p, right? The frame rate is pretty high, and we also do have a frame generation now as well, right? So I just wanted to show you that. I think let me just show you what the difference frame generation makes here, and then we'll move on to 1440p, because I don't think it's really necessary to test the medium presets, etc., if we are already getting 150 plus frames per second, right? So let me go ahead and enable the frame generation here. So let's just use frame generation. There's an auto and on, so I'm just going to leave it at on. Not sure what auto actually does. When I tested it earlier, it just reverted to on. Okay, so you can see we didn't gain that much. We gained around 30 frames per second, and at this frame rate, it's not a very high percentage gain in our frame rate. Now the frame rate being this high means the input latency is great. Like there's really no, I don't really notice anything with regards to the input latency being higher at this higher frame rate. Obviously when the frame rates are lower, the input latency does become a lot more noticeable. Right, so that's going to be it for 1080p. I'm sorry about the overlay on the top left hand corner. There's a quest text in the way there, but I do think the more important metrics are visible. All right, so let's move on to 1440p. All right, so we're now at 1440p and still on the very high preset, just with DLAA, no frame generation, and then also I just disabled motion blur, right? And that's pretty much it. So I know the weather changed quite a bit. Unfortunately, there's nothing I can do about that. It does have dynamic weather and stuff. Let me just reset our lows here. And you can see the frame time graph is a little bit more inconsistent now. So this is actually what I saw earlier. So it does seem that the frame time graph reacts to whatever's happening with the weather. So when there's a lot of rain, the frame time graph is not really that smooth. Whereas previously when I tested, it was actually pretty smooth. Now there are quite a few jumps in what you are seeing here. Those aren't frame time dips. It's just my connection to the server is sitting at 180 milliseconds, and every now and again there's a little bit of a rubber banding issue. So it's not perfect, but unfortunately there's no closer service to me, so this is the only way I can test. Alright, so around 100 frames per second at 1440p on the very high preset. Now you'd notice that the frame rate compared to the previous video is a little bit lower. by around 30% even at times, and that's this is with even a stronger GPU than tested earlier. So the average frame rate is lower, but I must say that the CPU usage helps a lot. The improvement in CPU usage not being that high definitely helps a lot. There's a lot less stuttering, and it's actually a pretty smooth experience. So let's see what DLSS quality can do here for us. Alright, so we're at DLSS quality, and once again there was a skip there, but it was not detected on the frame time graph, so I do believe it's server connection issues. Now you can see we are getting around 140 frames per second here. And in my previous video, I actually misspoke. I had the wrong information. I said the game is running on Unreal Engine 5, which it's not. And it's running on a custom Neo X engine, whatever that means. But there is a pre-shader compilation step when you start the game, and that's what got me confused. Right, but you can see that the visuals are definitely a lot better than what the game used to be. The grass especially used to be very blurry in the base game. So, or without these updates, and that's what I meant by they cleaned up very nicely. When I saw this guy in the distance, I thought it was a visual anomaly, but it's actually just a robot working extremely fast. Alright, so 140-ish frames per second. Our lows aren't that great, but as I said, the frame time graph, when it rains, it's actually very inconsistent, which is, I mean, it kind of makes sense, but it is kind of weird as well. Maybe it's just a lot of things react more when there's rain, but the frame time graph definitely takes a hit when there's adverse weather. But I do think that, you know, all these splashes and puddles or whatever has an effect on it, or have an effect on it. Alright, so let's just enable frame generation here. I don't think it's necessary to go with the lower DLSS setting, but I'll be testing just a frame generation, and then we'll just try the medium preset as well. Alright, so frame generation is enabled, and you can immediately see that the frame time graph smoothens out quite a lot, and we once again we're sitting at around 160 170 frames per second. So we did see kind of a nice boost to our frame rate here, going from 130 140 to around 160 to 180. It's a pretty nice bump, and once again, because the frame rate is so high, the input latency, it's very responsive. I don't notice any adverse input latency effects here. And as I said, the game looks plenty good. It's really a big improvement over the base game, and it's actually quite a fun game. I just had to start a new character because there's a new season that launched. I actually did stop playing a bit because of the extremely bad CPU usages, but you can see it's much better now. Right, so 170 frames per second, which is perfectly fine for somebody like me that owns a 165 Hz 1440p panel, and these are the settings that I'd use to play the game. Right, so I think I'm just going to drop this down to the mid preset, that's what it's actually called, and then we'll do some DLSS and frame generation test again, and then move to 4K. Right, so we are now seeing around 120-ish frames per second, which is around a 20% boost to our frame rate over the very high preset. Remember, this is native, and we basically got slightly more than this on the very high preset using DLSS quality, or more or less the same depending on where we are in the map, which way we are looking. And I actually do think it looks a bit sharper now, over sharpened at times, not sure why. Anyway, so personally, for the 4070 Ti Super, I'd be playing on the very high preset with the DLSS set to quality and then frame generation enabled. And it does seem to be that there's some shimmering in the grass with movement now as well, which I don't think, definitely wasn't apparent when we were on the very high preset. It might be some ambient occlusion or shadows that the quality is now lower, so it is a bit more noticeable, especially in the foliage. Alright, so 127 frames per second, a nice 27% boost to our frame rate, going from the very high preset, and sorry I had to witness that. Let's see if DLSS can still give us a bit of a performance boost. We are mostly GPU bound. You can see our GPU usage is between 95 and 99%. So DLSS should definitely make a difference here still. So let's see by how much. Alright, so that took us up to 170 frames per second. That's pretty much what we got on the very high preset with DLSS set to quality and frame generation enabled. So if you don't want the slight additional input latency that frame generation brings, then I mean, you can definitely play like this if you want to play at a high refresh rate. Well, this is a true high refresh rate experience because there's no added input latency. Although I do think that the game on very high definitely looks better than on the medium preset. Right, so 167-ish frames per second. The frame time graph is still pretty inconsistent. As I said, it's I do think it's related to the weather, because when we started this video it was not the case. These robots are still so funny. Right, anyway, 160-ish frames per second here, but our 0.1% lows are sitting at 66, which is not ideal. Right, let's see what frame generation can do here for us. Alright, so I enabled frame generation, but I disabled DLSS upscaling. I'm just using DLAA because I know some people ask me about that as well sometimes. And we are getting 150 frames per second, give or take. Our lows seem to be quite a bit better, and our frame time graph is a lot better as well. It does feel, it feels perfectly fine once again at 150 frames per second. Frame generation is not going to, you'd be hard pressed to notice it. I know some people will notice it, right? So some people are definitely a lot more sensitive when it comes to input latency. But I personally, how did I get to first person mode? Ah, there we go. Alright, so this is perfectly fine. Even in first person mode, aiming, it feels very responsive. And that's because our frame rate is so high. So let me just enable DLSS quality as well. Let's see if we can actually get to 200 frames per second here. Alright, so I enabled DLSS quality, but look at the edge of this lake here, or this pond. We are seeing quite a bit of shimmering, and that's because the shadow detail, wow, okay, this actually looks very horrible. But also that goes away when you switch to the very high preset. But we are very close to 200 frames per second here. Not sure if we can actually hit 200 at 201. There we go. So pretty decent experience if you are rocking a 240 hertz panel. You can try and max that out by using these settings, right? If you've got a 4070 Ti Super. All right, I think that's going to be it for 1440p. Let's move on to 4K. All right, we're now at 4K, and once again on the very high preset with the DLSS enabled, but DLAA. All right, so native resolution, everything on high, and motion blur still disabled. Now, I did not test the high preset because in my previous testing, the difference between the high and the very high preset is really minimal. That's why I jumped directly to the medium preset in my previous testing. And I must say, this looks phenomenal. Native 4K with DLAA, it really is an exceptionally good looking game. I'm not familiar with this Neo X engine, or Neox, I don't know how you pronounce it, but this is extremely good looking. And I'm playing this, well, I'm recording on a second PC which is connected to a 4K monitor pass through, and so I'm getting a full 4K image here. And it really does look great. We are dropping below 60 frames per second every now and again. Really not the end of the world. This game still feels perfectly fine at 60 frames per second. I'm not sure in boss fights whether it will actually drop below 60 more. It might, because there's definitely a lot more particle effects going on. And but I think in this specific area with these specific settings, it really is a very, very good looking game. Alright, so I think the only... I'm going to try and preserve this image quality, and let's just use DLSS set to quality, because I think it should do the job here. This really does look very, very good. Hopefully it comes across in the YouTube video well. Alright, so I just enabled DLSS quality, and we are getting 90-ish frames per second here. The game is very, very smooth, except for those small jumps, as I said. But as I said, those aren't picked up in the frame time graph, so it's definitely server related. And DLSS quality still looks perfectly fine. It really does look great. I do notice some shadow pop in though. I don't know if you noticed this tree's shadow just popped in when we got closer, but then it decided to stay. But this is actually a very, very good experience. This I'm not I'm not trying to sugarcoat anything here. It really does look great, especially when it's not raining, right? So the colors do pop, and the 4K resolution is just magnificent in this game. It really does stand out quite a lot. And even with the DLSS set to quality, I think we are getting a pretty good visual experience here. Alright, so 90-ish frames per second. Now, once again, I'm only testing in this specific area, right? Other areas might be more demanding, and but if I have to test every single area in this video, these videos would be hours long. So I'm just testing in specific areas which is or which are more easy to replicate if you want to try and test performance at home as well, right? So as I said, it might be a little bit more, oops, this guy's a little bit quicker. It might be more demanding in other areas, and you might think I'm misleading you with the performance, but this is what the performance is like in this specific area, right? Okay, so 90 frames per second here. I'm going to enable, let's try DLSS balanced. Let's see if we can get to 100 frames per second here, and let's see if DLSS balanced actually still looks pretty good. Alright, so we are set to DLSS balanced now, and in the distance it does look a little bit more soft, but it's still close up, it still looks pretty sharp, pretty good. But you can definitely notice the lower internal resolution a little bit further, well, for the further viewing distance. But we also did not gain that much. We gained around 10% going from DLSS quality to DLSS balanced, and it makes sense because the render resolution scale between them, the difference is very small. DLSS quality renders internally at 67% of the render of the resolution, and then DLSS balanced is 58% render resolution. So not that big a difference. So it makes sense that we're not seeing the biggest of performance bumps here. So I'm going to drop this back to DLSS quality. I think that's a perfect fit for this specific game, for 4K, and then I'm going to enable frame generation. Alright, so back at DLSS quality, and frame generation is enabled, and the motion fluidity is just it's sublime. The sharpness of 4K output resolution with the motion fluidity of 120 frames per second, I think it's very, very good, and definitely much better than what the game launched with, especially considering it did not have any frame generation or any upscaling techniques outside of a TSR, I believe it was. So this is a very, very good experience. Alright, so I think that's going to be it for the very high testing. I'm going to leave the exact settings as they are. I'm going to drop this down to high. Let's see if there's actually a difference when we change the settings to high. Actually, let's change everything back to native and without frame generation, and we were getting around 60 frames per second, right? So frame generation disabled, and let's go with the DLAA, and then let's drop this down to the high preset instead of not saying I need to restart the game for the changes to take effect. Alright, so I restarted the game, and let me just refresh my numbers here, and now there's some weird flickering in the background there. Okay. But there's definitely a lot more pop in here and a lot more visual anomalies on the high preset, and we went from around 60-ish frames per second to just over 70 frames per second. So it is a decent-ish frame rate increase, but the medium definitely gave us a bit of a bigger boost. Although this should maintain 60 frames per second most of the time, especially in this specific area at 4K, right, which is pretty good. And as I said, the game still looks plenty good. It runs very well, and the input latency is very, very good as well. The game is very responsive. So I think I'm going to stick to the high preset, because let's not try and restart the game again. I'm not going to test the medium, because the medium preset did look kind of funky to me anyway. So going to enable frame generation here, then DLSS, or let's start with DLSS first, and then we'll just do frame generation and then do both. Right, so we'll just enable DLSS set to quality here. And if we have a look at our frame rate now, we went from 70-ish frames per second to 100 and something frames per second. So very, very good actually. And we're still not using frame generation, so the input latency, as I said, it's very responsive. But as I mentioned earlier, even at the previous frame rates, 150 to 170 frames per second, the additional input latency for frame generation is definitely not noticeable at all. Not by me anyway. Some of you might notice it, but I definitely did not. Right, so I think the game looks plenty good here at 4K. I might actually be tempted to lock this to 60 and use this 4K monitor to play this game further. I think it looks stunning. All right, enough about that. Let's see what frame generation does here for us, and then we can enable both. As you can see, there is quite a bit of visual anomalies. Sometimes the shadows would just pop in, and it happened less on the very high preset. So I'm more inclined to just use that, the very high preset over the high or the medium preset. But it seems like the moment it loaded in, see, there's definitely a lot of visual anomalies here. I don't know why. It's very, very strange. So let's enable frame generation with our DLSS, and then we'll enable both. All right, so still the high preset, DLAA and frame generation enabled, and we are still getting around 102 frames per second, so pretty much the same as what we had when we enabled DLSS without frame generation using these settings. The input latency is now a little bit more noticeable because we're starting from a base frame rate of around 70. It's still fine. I wouldn't mind playing like this, but it is definitely a lot more noticeable now. But the visual anomalies, that's kind of weird. Look at the house there on the... And now it's complete. There we go. Okay, so while the game is definitely much better, there does seem to be some issues still. You can see the trees are flickering quite a bit when I move, and I do think that the very high preset does mitigate that. So that's where I'll be playing. But it still looks plenty good, I think. So let's combine DLSS with frame generation here and see if we can get... I don't think we'll get 140 frames per second, but we might be able to maintain 120. Actually, yeah, so frame generation is enabled, so we'll just use DLSS quality here. And let's see if we get to 120 out. So 130 frames per second. And I'm just looking for the shimmering, and the shimmering is definitely still there, but it is kind of distracting, and it's very weird because this only started happening when I restarted the game. Maybe something went wrong, maybe another restart of the game is required here. But 120, 130 frames per second, definitely definitely playable at 4K output resolution. And the input latency, although we only gained like 30 frames per second, the input latency is definitely not that noticeable anymore, and it's a pretty decent experience. And you can't really call it a high refresh rate experience because of the added input latency, but the motion fluidity is great. I love it. All right, I think that's going to be it for this video. I just wanted to see whether the latest patch has actually improved the game, and the conclusion here is that the base frame rate is kind of lower, but the CPU usage is much better, and the performance consistency is also much improved, I think. All right, thank you guys for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.